Welcome, everyone, to another episode of DRM Unfiltered, the podcast that dares to go beyond the buzzwords. Get ready. We're going to have some bold conversations with experts, clients, and industry leaders transforming capital program delivery from real world breakthroughs to game changing strategies and success stories. We're serving unfiltered insights that fuel innovation and inspire the future of project controls. No fluff, no filters, just the voices shaping tomorrow. Today's topic is project controls in high-risk environment and a conversation with OGCS Global. Our guest is Daryl Townsend, who's the Vice President of Project Controls. Welcome, Daryl. Thank you for taking the time out to sit down with us and have a discussion. I'd like to have you maybe introduce yourself and give a little bit of background.
Sure, Dan. Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and talk with you again. I know it's been a number of years since we've been together at some conferences, but looking forward to the conversation. So yeah, a little bit about myself real quick. I'm actually a mechanical engineer by school. Started my career as a pipe designer working for Fluor in the Sugarland office here in outside Houston. They transferred me to Alaska a couple, 3 years into my start and went up for a 6-month project. And 15 years later, I moved back to the Houston area. I did most of my work for Arco, Phillips, ConocoPhillips, BP. Those were the major players up there. And of course, the silent partner that was up there for that duration also was Exxon. And then probably about 4, 5, 6 years into my career up there, I kind of fell into project controls by accident. I was up there working on the slope as a facility engineer, and I got invited to attend a sure track training class for those that have been around Primavera for years. And it kind of took to it pretty quick, and actually a former McNatty employee, a trainer, Kelly Cuthbertson was the trainer at that time. So that word got back to my boss, which Kelly and my boss are good friends. And so eventually I fell into her overload, if you will. And then eventually that came into a full-time role doing project controls and scheduling for her full-time. I eventually transferred back into Houston. And then from Houston, scattered around, mostly being in Houston, but I scattered around doing project reviews of the portfolio. So I was kind of bouncing around the world, looking at different projects, looking at different schedules, some pretty large, 5 billion or more in some cases. So we had a pretty big portfolio back there in the early 2000s. So it was quite the ride. I've had a good time. Project Controls has been very good to me and my family. So I hope to continue doing it and try to stay on the cutting edge. Although getting assigned to a single project at a time, it's which has been the case over the last 5 or 6 years. It's kind of hard to venture out and even get to conferences like I wish I could. So anyway.
Well, we'll have to make sure we get you to some conferences. You'd be interested in what they're showing nowadays. But thanks for the introduction. We'll jump right into this. You're talking about project controls and, the industry that you're in. What makes project controls in oil and gas fundamentally different from other industries?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that. It's in some cases it's not different, but in other cases it is different. So with oil and gas, it's kind of a mixed bag. So in some of the large projects, which typically a lot of the oil and gas projects are large, both maybe footprint size, geographically, the teams that are engaged, but also in terms of financial. So I've been on a number of projects that are $5 billion, $10 billion. And so a lot of the differences end up being financially. I mean, I supported for a while the Qatar gas project that was building four LNG trains side by side at the same time, and there was 50,000 workers there on site. So they were burning, 1.5 million man hours a week. And there's some projects that I know that I've also supported that might have a total for the life of that project of 1 million hours or even less, right? So it's interesting that and we're trying to provide that forward looking just like we are on a small project, and also integrating engineering and procurement, construction, uh, cost and schedule, and all into this one lump, if you will. Uh, and so the other complexity, I guess I would say, is that the number of stakeholders involved. So with these large projects, it's typically not one owner company that's doing the project. You may have two or three partners, which makes more complexity in the reporting cycle because every company wants to see the report in a certain way in a certain format. So it just adds to the more complexity. It's honestly a lot more time consuming to build three different monthly reports based on the clients that might want them differently, right? So yeah, it's a fun world. But the most recent project that I'm working on is not oil and gas. Although most of us that are on it came from oil and gas. So we do shake our heads every once in a while and look at each other going, really, we're doing it this way on this job? And why? So it has been a little bit eye-opening that there are some fundamental differences that we didn't actually appreciate, I guess, as much as we do now.
Okay, well, that kind of leads into my next question, talking about a different project type that you're on. OGCS supports projects across multiple continents and regulatory environments. How do you adapt your controls framework to different regions and project types?
Yeah, well, we kind of have a fundamental framework, if you will. And then we kind of, because we have been in some international portions of the world, um, we kind of have a best practices, if you will. But then, of course, we got to adapt, right, for the different contracting structures because and I guess I didn't appreciate at the time when we started doing some of these international jobs, just how differently the contracting might be. In some cases, I know I did a project a few years back in Mexico, and the local content requirement was such that it was really, really a lot more than I expected. They wanted a really high percentage of local content, so the resources, the people, and a lot of the materials had to be purchased locally, at least in Mexico proper. The other thing that comes into play, regulatory requirements, and then beyond that, which was another big one, is the execution culture, right? So particularly in Mexico, the working environment's quite a bit different here than U.S. And then say Mexico and Indonesia, China, India, the amount of people that are available in those regions to work is significantly more uh, than say in a U.S. environment, plugging it in. So right, so trying to maintain consistent principles across that whole project environment becomes quite challenging. Again, it starts out with just having that framework to start with. Hope for the best, right?
It's funny, you mentioned, complexity, and that kind of leads me into what are some of the biggest drivers of complexity in today's energy and infrastructure programs?
So some of the problems that we've run into recently, the just the scale, the supply chain has become a huge issue for us just because of the demands, and honestly, for in many cases, we've not recovered from our COVID days of the supply chain extended length durations for getting deliveries. The other thing that's worked completely against us is this compressed schedule that keeps popping up, it seems, on every project that I seem to work on. The first thing the project manager or the leadership team wants to do once they hear how long the project's going to take is, they say, well, we need to do it 25% faster than what you've said. So what that's done for us is now you've got a lot tighter integration now between the engineering, procurement, construction, to be successful. So, what you might have done in the past, you might have gotten your engineering to a 90% before you actually went out to get your procurement. And then your construction effort might at one time start when most of your procurement was in place. And now what you've done is you've compressed that. So you're sadly, in some cases, maybe 50% or maybe less done than 50% in engineering when you start your procurement. And in other cases, along those same lines, you may start construction well before you start getting much of your material. So it compresses. Um, it's really caused quite the mess with a lot of projects too, because this compressed nature. Um, because contractors typically, the more time you spend, the longer that actually ends up growing. Something else that we've had to deal with recently, um, in some of these places, you're not close to a major community or a major infrastructure area. So maybe you've got to do something different. You have to build maybe a man camp so that you can house those people that are actually going to do the construction. Um, and then how do you get them back and forth? If you're fortunate enough where you can just walk out your dorm door and into the work site, you're great. But a couple jobs I worked on recently, they might have an hour drive on a bus to get to that work site. So it becomes quite a different environment. And then what do you do to entice that worker to stay there and stay there for the duration of the project? Because turnover becomes a huge issue at some point too, right? And then all along the way, if you're in this environment, what are you going to do to the local community to make sure that you don't end up creating bad vibes or some real dissent against the particular project you're coming in that's going to benefit the community? So there's lots of other resources that you might not and ideas that you might not think about initially as you come into this, and you may end up doing, and several projects I've been associated with have done that, end up doing community projects where maybe you build a school or you build a park or something like that to try to be good neighbors to the community that you're now injecting yourself into. So yeah.
All right, perfect. We're going to switch gears just a little bit here. I mean, you talk about your engineering background, your project controls, your scheduling, but when we worked together, you were known as for your risk practices that you do. So I kind of want to dive into that a little bit. So what tools or capabilities have had the biggest impact on improving predictability and transparency in these projects?
Well, Dan, you brought that up, and that Deltek Acumen tool suite's has always had a sweet spot for me. And actually, it's funny enough, and it brings back my age again a little bit, or my years in the trenches. Prior to the Deltek suite, we had PertMaster, which became part of the Deltek suite when it became the Acumen, when Risk was added into the Acumen suite. So I've been doing that for a number of years. And the Deltek's been very supportive, using the tools. The Deltek team themselves have been, easy to ask questions of. I guess I don't remember the exact name, but there's essentially a suggestion box of ideas and thoughts to improve the tool. So they've been pretty good there. And obviously with the Acumen suite, I've done tons of schedule reviews and forensics analysis, and the risk module has been very good for that. The the other thing that's come up with the Acumen suite is that it does have that flexibility. I can get a schedule out of MS Project that some contractors tend to use, the smaller ones especially. And it's been pretty forthcoming and giving me some good answers. So they do come to realize using the MS Project that it's a lot more forgiving once they see how P6, the rigidity that P6 brings to the table. And so the sophistication and in MS Project is there, but they try to keep it simple, I guess. The big thing on the risk is to try to do the integration, which a lot of companies don't do because they have another cost tool that they use, SAP or something other. And so they typically keep the schedule and cost in two separate environments, even when doing risk analysis. So the Acumen suite allows you to integrate those because you definitely want cost, schedule, and risk all to be implemented together to get your most likely outcome. Otherwise, you may be leaving something off the table. But for sure, using risk and some companies, some I've even worked for, they do the risk exercise only for purposes of getting to the next funding gate so they can get their next tranche of money. But the ones that I've seen to be more successful are companies that actually get in that risk tool, and maybe they do it once a year, maybe they do it every 6 months. I've been with some outfits that have actually done their risk exercise on a quarterly basis just with their current schedule because it's capable of doing so. And I think those teams that do that and run through a risk register and keep that risk register updated are keeping a lot more. I guess they have a better outlook, or they have a better forecast of what their project is actually going to end up costing and how long it's physically going to take.
Yeah. Well, energy and infrastructure projects, they both carry unique risks, whether they be commercial, environmental, geopolitical, supply chain. You mentioned that. How do you quantify and manage those types of risks?
Well, it's funny, and I probably have a hard time finding it right now just because I'm in the process of transferring from one computer to another. But I have a risk template, if you will, which is a long list of risks that I've kind of attracted over the years, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And I carry it with me into every risk session that I have, especially when I'm first starting out, so that I can trigger some of the risks that are on that list may not be applicable on that particular project, but it may trigger the conversation about another risk that actually is. Um, the other thing with risk is that some project teams are very in tune with the whole idea of risk and the concept, and other teams it's a foreign concept to them. So we have to spend a good bit of time. It's what I like to call it's an education opportunity, right, for them to be brought into the fold to understand what it is, because you have the ability to really turn some heads and to get some people thinking in those terms. And many people are thinking in those concepts, but they may not be using the same terminology that we typically use. And so it just depends on the group. The landscaping, the landscape is changing, as we know. I mean, we don't have to look any further than this week. of what's going on over in the Middle East to know that there's some big risk out there. Now, some of my challenge in doing even the projects that I'm working on right now, and one I have some construction elements, um, some material that's actually not in that region, but has to go through that region to get over here to the U.S. And we're investigating ideas about how we might be able to truck it to a different location to try to get it back into the U.S. Um, and so we got some ideas. Some of those things can be absorbed into the schedule as it is now, but obviously there's some big ones out there that you may, and I try to at least identify those that would be excluded risk so that I don't end up blowing the project schedule, blowing the budget just because there's no way I could fund every possible outcome into the project budget. So, we joke sometimes about these what we call excluded risk, but I've been on some projects where some of those excluded risks have happened, like a company filing for bankruptcy, which we've all seen that happen over the last 5 or 10 years with some of the major companies, even, and not just the mom and pops that come and go. And we've seen some things burn that maybe were a fabricator of ours. Um, Commercially, too, we have some issues, and some projects actually get scrubbed or put on the cutting board because they have unrealistic expectations. Working in Alaska as long as I did, we saw some crazy environmental events, planned or not planned, and so we had to keep our eyes open over what might happen. We've had spills that have occurred through equipment failure, human error. Uh, but really, the biggest thing comes down to is that we need to have a structured risk identification, and then we have to have an owner because technically, if we don't have an owner, that risk almost gets lost in the list, right? Because if we don't have somebody to point to that's gonna grab the bull by the horns and take on it and hold on to it, and then we have to translate those risks then to quantified cost and schedule impacts through a workshop and then probabilistic analysis. And I mentioned it already, but this live risk process back and forth over a good frequency on a given project, um, feeding it back into the project controls tools and analysis, we can really hone in on our issues and hopefully come up with a better project at the end.
You had mentioned triggers. What triggers or early warning indicators do you rely on to identify when a project is drifting?
So I mentioned a little bit about the overlap between the engineering and procurement and then construction activities. Um, what I have seen a lot of times actually is there's and the in the overlap is that there ends up being the logic between those. I've seen it and seen several cases where you think the procurement should be driving the construction activity, but in fact, maybe that logic string is not there. And it's missing. And so there's the either the schedule duration, the logic, the constraint change, and then obviously the productivity of a given group too. Um, so back to my acumen tools. I use forensics a lot, so I'm constantly bouncing versions of the schedule around, looking at things that have changed, and then so a lot of folks, if they don't have that tool, all they have to lean on is look at, say, the key milestones at the top of the schedule, or at least that's where my key milestones are in my layouts. And if I look only at those, I'm not getting the whole picture, because what could be happening is they could be changing the logic, they could be adding logic, um, they could be changing durations, and maybe the float values are bouncing around the place, and the key milestones may not be moving once at all, but the whole project is shifting to the right, but it's not understood or seen that way because those key milestones that everybody seems to look at. And so I'm constantly looking at logic changes, constraint changes, duration changes. And so a remaining duration in a schedule should always be going down from one update to the next. But if I see a remaining duration that increased, guess what? That means that activity got longer. And if the logic is there, then it should be pushing out the project. But if they made a logic change with that activity, maybe it doesn't. Maybe so if you have a 10,000 activity schedule and you've got 30,000 relationships, and you change, just let's just say you change 3,000 relationships from one update to the next, there's a good chance that you're changing the relationships to maintain those key dates. And I'm constantly looking at those because I think that's a way to get around and cause some trouble. The biggest deal for me though is looking at those relationships between engineering. So if engineering should be driving procurement and procurement should be driving construction, if I'm missing some big relationships there between those three major components, I'm missing the boat. Because in these days, and I mentioned it earlier too, about the procurement items and the supply chain. There's some supply chain activities that 2 years, 3 years is not unheard of for some of these compressors, right? Well, that's obviously going to be a driver. But if you know it's 3 years and it doesn't show up in your list of critical items, then what's happened? Is the logic not there? So I saw one just not too long ago that I knew that 3 year delivery should be driving, and it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't was because it was tied finish to finish with the construction activity instead of finish to start, which it's kind of hard to deal with that.
Classic schedule manipulation.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent. Maybe on a little bit more personal level, can you share a moment when your strong risk practice actually helped you avoid a major issue?
Yeah, so and it's actually unfortunately rearing its head again for me. Um, on another project, and it's bringing back memories. So we went through a risk analysis a number of years ago. So for those not maybe in the Gulf of Mexico region, where I am, in July and August, September, hopefully not October, but actually sometimes in October too. The humidity in the summertime and the daytime hours have a way of creating their own storms, if you will. Most of the wind, the dominating wind coming off the Gulf Coast, coming off the southeast. So you have this buildup of clouds every day, and if the climate stays fairly the same, you can watch it day to day, and you can see that cloud. Okay, that cloud to the north's getting built bigger, and the next day it gets a little bit bigger. And then after that happens 3 or 4 or 5 days, all of a sudden you start to get these storms that just pop up from seemingly nowhere. And they happen, maybe every afternoon at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon for a couple hours, and then they blow over and they're gone. Um, and so what the project that I was working, when we went through the risk analysis, we did not appreciate that to the degree that we should have. Um, and so we thought we did, but the reality and the actuals told us a different story. And in fact, we had 30, let's see, in the two early years when we were doing civil work, which was dirt work. So we were, before we poured any concrete or had any foundations or slabs out, um, we had about 30 days of weather that were impacting the construction schedule. Um, and then later we had probably 20 days. But what was done in the schedule for the original estimate and what made it into the deterministic schedule, I believe, was like 3 days for a year. And so we missed it by over 30 days. And those are just full day shutdowns. What we also didn't appreciate in those storms that I mentioned earlier is the storm it might not rain at the site, but we might get a thunderstorm and see lightning within a 10-mile radius that would shut construction down, and everybody would have to come down off of the height, down the ground, down into a lunch tent and hang out there until it was all clear, which coincidentally or not coincidentally, it would typically happen at 1 or 2 in the afternoon. So everybody would have to come down. And then guess what? About 3:30, 4 o'clock, you get the all clear, and guess what? It's about time to go home, right? So we didn't appreciate that either, and that happened, a lot, at least 30 times over that course of that same window. So fast forward to a project I'm on right now, and it actually did it coincidentally, it all happened the same way. So I just got last week a spreadsheet from the contractor on site, and he'd actually been keeping up with it. And he had 30 days of downtime for weather. No, take that back. It wasn't that. He had 16 days, full days, where we were for either snow, ice, or bad weather. And then he had another 15 days of partial days. So that was anywhere from 1 hour to 6 hours. And somebody asked the question yesterday while I was in another meeting. They texted me and they said, what was in the basis of schedule for the project? And I had to go back and look. And it was 2 days a year for weather days. And so guess what? We're gonna do a risk analysis here in the next 2 weeks, and so we're gonna make sure that we include 15 or 20 days of weather as opposed to two, because we definitely missed the boat on that one. So that's one thing that's come back to bite me. But fortunately, we're in the middle of doing a risk analysis, so we'll be able to fix our own problem before it gets worse. But I'm not sure what's going to happen with the year that we just had and how that's going to be resolved. So, but that's it. Yeah.
Nice. So, in your opinion, what's one misconception project teams often have about the role of controls?
So I said this yesterday to somebody that was a little frustrated with a response they got from somebody else, I believe. I didn't know the whole story. I heard part of it. Um, I looked at her and said, well, technically we're just messengers, right? I mean, we're collecting data and we're putting it in a different format. And by that I mean it could be P6, it could be in the unifier, um, it could be in another tool, but we're reporting that message back about how the project's doing, right? But we're collecting data from all different sources, and so um, we're reporters. In fact, we may know more about the project than most anybody else on the team because we are got our fingers into a little bit of everything. But the other misconception, I guess I would say to that beyond the fact that we're just messengers is that we're reporting um, performance after the fact. which in fact is a little true, backward looking, but what we should be doing is using that data for the past to actually help provide forward looking insight analysis. So, with the information that we have, and many that, depending on what the answer is, might not like the answer, but we may be able to tell you because of the information that we have from the past performance to look forward. We may be able to tell you that the project's going to take 3 months longer or 6 months longer, and it's going to cost you X million dollars more than what you have in your budget because we've taken the past performance and applied it and be able to actually create an educated insight and analysis into the forward forecast, right? So I think we do take a bad rap sometimes when when things go sour. That it's always the scheduler's fault that's the problem. And in fact, the reality is that we're just telling the message. In fact, we probably told the whole story three baselines ago, right? Three baselines ago, the real story that kept getting changed because they didn't like the answer, and then eventually get to the end. And I've always wanted to keep risk assessments and especially if I was on a project for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, keep the old risk assessments of what my original analysis said versus what the altered analysis said to see what the project really finished at, versus in times of cost and schedule, as opposed to what we were we were trained to say the answer was, right?
Awesome. That's a great story. One last question before we wrap it up here. You told us the different hats you've worn in your long career. What's one lesson from your very long career that still guides how you lead today?
No, I don't like to think about it being a very long career. I just started. Um, Although I see a lot of people now in the office, and I've kind of taken back because it's like, wow, they're younger than my kids. It's like it's kind of funny, but we're all just trying to do the best job with the facts that we have, and share a message about the status of the project. We're all trying to do a good job. Uh, Nobody, at least anybody that I've worked with, nobody's out to sabotage the job, to beat it down. Uh, the other thing to me, for me personally, you don't know what somebody's dealing with outside of work, right? So maybe the reaction that they got from a particular heated instance. That could be completely unrelated to a stressful moment. You don't know. I know my wife with the cancer deal. Um, there's a lot of people hiding behind a smile, right? That you don't know anything about. I'm just going to say it that way. And just be kind to people, right? Because we spend literally more time with the people that we work with than we do with our families. And so they become our family in some degree. And I laugh a little bit because mine's the same way, but everybody's family has got their own little problems and issues. There's no perfect families around, or if there is, I haven't met one yet. But yeah, just be kind to people. I mean, it's a fun journey to be on. The experiences and the places that I've been, it would not have happened were it not for project controls. And I don't take that for granted, and try to do things in each of those locations that I wouldn't do maybe otherwise. Maybe I eat something that I wouldn't have eaten otherwise, or maybe I go do something that I wouldn't have done if I'd have been at home. But yeah, and like I said before, just always be kind to people. Like, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes and what things are going on in people's lives that's outside of work, because there's lots of bad things out there, and you don't know. So
That's a great message, Daryl. And I really appreciate you sharing that. Sharing your journey, sharing your answers to our questions, and joining us today. And maybe sometime down the road we can do this again, and we'll dive a lot deeper into maybe something you and I know a lot about. But thank you very much. If you got anything you want to close out with, please feel free to share.
yeah, Dan, appreciate the time. It's a great forum. It's there's lots of things, and I'm always intrigued every time. Unfortunately, I haven't been to a conference in a couple years, but I'm always intrigued to go into conferences, just what some of the knowledge, the people that we work with day in and day out, or close proximity to the knowledge that people carry around with them. I'm always encouraged listening and talking to people. I tell myself, and I've taught a number of P6 classes, standing behind somebody that's used P6 and seeing them do something. There's always somebody is doing something slightly different, getting to the same result that I get to, but they might have done it differently. And I wait a minute, do that again. Show me how you did that. So, and they're using a keystroke or using a right click or something and I'm using it a different way, got to the same end. But yeah, there's all kinds of people out there. And don't be afraid to ask. I mean, and we have a lot of younger people out there now that are actually pretty savvy with the software. Yeah, there's lots of kids these days that I encounter that are real sharp with the software. So don't take any of that for granted.
Well, we'll have to get you either out of the office, out of the house, or out of your remote site. I'm actually doing 4 events over the next 7 weeks. So, uh,
Wow.
starting tomorrow, I head out to Vegas tomorrow for Construction Management Association of America event.
Oh, good. Good luck. Safe travels.
But Daryl, thanks again for spending the time with us today. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we can do this again somewhere down the road.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.